Good luck. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Binary Bias with us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping to start us off. This session is being recorded. However, participants won't be visible in the recording. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat bar and we will try and address them towards the end. And starting off in true fashion, I would like to provide the acknowledgement of country. I would like to start by acknowledging Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging, and respectfully acknowledge the Awabakal, Wongal and Giadigal people of the Elinore Nation, peoples of this land on which I am joining you today. And I'd also like to extend that respect to any Indigenous people joining us here tonight. So introducing our wonderful guests, we have Elinore Wilkin and Adam Doherty. Elle is a person who pursues exploring life beyond the binary, spending much of their time in bush, camping, crafting, opal mining, and partying on various dance floors. They're creating life surrounded by beautiful community and exciting experiences. Elle has worked 10 years in the community sector with a focus on strategy and community engagement in refugee settlement, LGBTQ+ health and First Nations adult education. They are now focused on sex and relationship education in high schools and building homes and strong communities. So welcome, Elle.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Very excited to have this conversation.
And we also have Adam, working as a non-binary and interdisciplinary artist and graphic designer. Adam's practice and research seeks to navigate queer subjectivity while interrogating the relationship between queerness and institutions such as the archive, seeking to continue the active queering of space through the medium of emotionally charged handmade textiles and digital design. Adam's work is also a platform and promotes queer joy in all of its forms. Outside of their practice as an artist, Adam works as the Digital Projects Officer at Tranby Aboriginal Cooperative, supporting First Nations students across Australia and their learning journey. So welcome, Adam.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're very excited to kind of get into knowing you guys a little bit better. So I'd like to start off with some questions. And if Adam, you'd like to go first.
Sure.
How would you define non-binary?
Sure. Well, I guess first of all, I just want to say hi, everyone, and just also say that I use he, they pronouns because I think obviously with what we're doing tonight, we should be talking pronouns. It's very important.
Absolutely.
So I think for me, how I would define the term non-binary, that was your question, right? Wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, good. I was just like, make sure I didn't forget myself already. It's interesting. It's one of those questions that like, people do often ask when they are that, you know, it's not something they have experience with. And it's one of those things that it is like the whole point of being non-binary is that it almost can't be defined in that way. And it's that thing of, you know, personally for me, I think I see it almost as almost like as a way to kind of understand one's own personal energy and one's way in which your energy kind of sits and is manifested in the world. And so for me, like I, you know, don't see non-binary as kind of like a third option, right, to male or female, which I think is often a misconception, is that people kind of see it as a third alternative. Whereas for me, it was really liberating because I kind of came to see it as more of an opening up of my gender and allowing it to kind of be seen as kind of an energy that oscillates between masculine and feminine rather than male or female, and then kind of as being somewhere in between the two of those. So I think personally that's really how I see being non-binary and how I would define it when I explain it to other people, is that it's kind of that oscillation between the masculine and feminine and something that's kind of changing all the time, which is actually really nice and exciting.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put. And you're right, society does have this urge to kind of categorize people and put them into neat little boxes. So it's really refreshing to kind of embrace that human element to it. What about yourself, Elinore? How would you define non-binary?
Yeah, I mean, also, yeah, hi, I'm Elle. I she, they, he pronouns. I mean, anything for me is cool. Really. I also want to like add on my acknowledgement of country, if that's okay. I was born and raised on Gadigal land, sometimes traversing into Gadigal Wongal land. I've been privileged enough to spend a lot of time on Guringai country, Wiradjuri, Yamilaroi, Gamilaroi, and for me, having acknowledging the traditional custodians of that land is really an understanding that they are the custodians. They've been caring for this land since a time before we can imagine, and we're like fortunate enough to live in this like fantastically, incredibly beautiful space. And it is so because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been caring for this country forever. So always massive gratitude for that, and massive gratitude for elders past and present. And I think an understanding that we are, you know, always in the presence of these emerging elders, and not just in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander spaces, but you've got these sort of people who have this wisdom. And I think that that's huge and really exciting to be able to acknowledge and have gratitude for. And yeah, non-binary. I mean, I love what Adam said, and we've had some interesting conversations about this, obviously, because if you get non-binary people in a room together, we're always like, what is and I think like a big thing and a big part of the reason why I was excited to be involved in this conversation is that non-binary isn't really like scary. And I think for a lot of people, it feels like it is because it sits outside of the way this world's being constructed in a way that we can understand it. And so a lot of people are like, oh, like they, them, what does that mean? How do I use those pronouns? And I know that the answer that people want to what is non-binary is definitive. And unfortunately, as was already said, we can't give you that. It's basically kind of, if you actually break down the language and think about it, we are born into and live in a very binary world when we're talking about gender. And anyone who's traversed in any sort of, you know, been lucky enough to do a gender studies class or listen to a podcast about it or whatever, will come across a conversation about gender as a construct, right? That and babies all cry the same amount until they're like 7 years old, and then boys stop crying. And some kids like trucks and some kids like Barbies, but we decide to funnel them into girls are pink and boys are blue. And in fact, that construct, that contract that was written out with those specifics of gender, I didn't fucking sign up to that. Sorry, pardon my language. I didn't sign up to that. I didn't sign up to that contract, and being non-binary and expressing the non-binary aspects of myself is a way for me to express that I didn't sign up to be this woman who has to behave in a way just because I was born with a vulva and a vagina and ovaries. Like, I didn't sign up to being put in this box like that. And I think a lot of people feel similarly and find it challenging to express that. And non-binary is just one way of expressing that. There are a lot of different ways that people do, from gender fluidity to, being trans, to gender non-conformity, and sort of saying, you know, actually you decided that I was a boy when you wrote that on my birth certificate, but that wasn't done with my consent. And what you decided a boy was supposed to look like also wasn't done with my consent. And so I'm gonna, you know, break the bias, so to speak, right? That's what we've called this conversation. And that's what it means for me. And it means a lot of different things for different people. But I think you'll find a lot of people who identify as non-binary can identify with that aspect of the conversation.
Yeah, no, that's really beautifully put as well. And thank you also for your acknowledgement of country. It was absolutely beautiful to hear that. And you're right, I really like the analogy as well with the contract, and that it was kind of done without consent, because that's something that a lot of people can resonate with and connect with. So That's a really good analogy to kind of align with this conversation. Starting with you for the next question, when was the first time you heard the term non-binary?
Oh man, I was thinking about this. So I'm actually not sure what the first time that I heard the term. I'm not sure when that was, and I don't have a specific time that I sort of was like, oh, non-binary, that applies to me. But I think maybe the most useful way that I can share my experience in relation to this question is that I spent this period of time thinking about the times when I feel masculine and the times when I feel feminine. And how can I think about that in this inherent way that sits outside of those gender norms and those gender roles and those gender constructs? And when I started to break that down, I didn't feel any firmness around it at all. So for example, when I was growing up, I might have been considered a bit of a tomboy, or, the way that I live my life now, I like to do a bit of manual labor. I like to go with work with my hands, but I also like to get my nails done and, wear jewelry and do fun things with my hair or whatever, these things that are considered feminine. And I kind of think that's bullshit. I don't think that those things should be considered feminine or masculine. And when I started to sort of think about, spending time in spiritual spaces and people having these ideas about this feminine side and the masculine side of you, and having this feminine energy that's like flowy and nurturing, and this masculine energy that is like structured and firm and assertive, I was like, how are they not related to the constructs of gender? That's not about what's between my legs or the hormones in my body or the chromosomes that I have. That's about those gender constructs. And when I started going around and asking other people, like, what are the times that you feel masculine and what are the times that you feel feminine? And I was thinking, like I said, I'd spent this time on the opal fields, like operating a jackhammer into a wall, right? And I'd spent this time at a girls' high school, and neither of those times like made me feel masculine or feminine, or it did make me feel both, and it was all quite nonsensical. And I was having a conversation with a non-binary friend of mine, and they were like, babe, you sound non-binary as all hell. And I was like, true. Was when I started really diving into that and realizing that was how I quite strongly identified. Yeah.
Wow, that's an incredible story. And I like how you kind of describe the feeling of masculinity and also being feminine as well. And I think if the more people kind of were true to themselves and started leaning into those, would have a better society. And I guess that's what we're aiming for with these kind of conversations.
I mean, I think so. And exploring these things doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to lead to this like non-binary conclusion like I did. Mm-hmm. There might be say, I feel so feminine and I love being in touch with my femininity, regardless of, the body that you were born in or the gender that you were assigned at birth, non-consensually in your birth certificate. You might have been assigned a female and be like, I feel like a woman and I want to be a woman and I want to express myself as a woman. And that's also legit. Like that's just not the conclusion that I came to.
Yeah. And everyone does have those feelings of being, feminine and also masculinity. And like you said, it doesn't mean that you're non-binary, but acknowledging those kind of feelings and what kind of triggers them and what kind of nurtures those feelings as well is important for people to kind of understand when looking for acceptance as well, because it's not something that's exclusive for non-binary people. It's something that everyone kind of experiences. So I think that's a really good common thread. How about you, Adam? When was the first time you heard non-binary?
Yeah, I think it is similar to Elle. It's one of those things that's very hard to pinpoint, like exactly when you kind of first were like, this is something that makes sense with me and resonates with me. But I think, like, echoing what Elle has said, it's like that thing of, also acknowledging that's like, right, like everyone contains multitudes and everyone has the capacity for masculine and feminine, and one does not come without the other. But it is about, when you're talking about, being gender diverse, non-binary, trans, and being part of that community, it's about, recognizing that the alignment of those energies with the way that society has kind of placed gender upon a particular person is where there's that kind of incongruity that creates, this desire, and then also this kind of expression of gender in a way that's kind of not considered within the binary, right? And so I think for me, it was just that thing of I feel like I went through that process of kind of multiple comings out, because it's like, you know, coming out as gay, then kind of feeling that queer was a better term, and then kind of moving on to also then coming out again to be non-binary. And in some ways, the non-binary coming out was actually more difficult, because there was a lot more explaining to go on that people just found really, really confusing, right? Because it's like these days, it's like if you say to people that you're gay, like most people kind of can get what that means pretty easily. But if you're like, oh, but I'm also non-binary, it's like, well, wait, what? What does that mean? Like, what are you talking about? So I think for me, it was just that, like, I just kind of came to realize that I found being referred to as a man and being referred to as male, I found it deeply uncomfortable. And I kind of, it wasn't until I actually took stock of that I was like, oh, something's not quite adding up here for me. And there's kind of some further exploration that I need to do around my gender, because it was just that and it was once I was more comfortable in my own queerness that I felt safe, I think, to explore that more. But it really was that kind of feeling of, like, you know, that gendered language and being kind of lumped into certain categories based on how people interpreted me and how I visually appear, that didn't align. And that was where I was like, okay, there's something else for me going on here. And that's kind of eventually led to what, you know, now choosing to identify as and being non-binary, because it was just that feeling of like, yeah, it was just different, the difference between how I felt on the inside and how people made assumptions about me because of how I appear physically on the outside. So I think when I took the time to really kind of take stock of that, that was really when, you know, the kind of concept of being non-binary really kind of came into, you know, really came to the fore for me. And I think the other thing too is, you know, before kind of non-binary, there was more, for me personally, a lot of talk around pronouns, right? Because that was kind of the way in for me. And I think what was just like hugely illuminating and so like such a relief for me is because I spent the longest time like not feeling non-binary enough, in that sense of, again, it was that other kind of label of like, okay, this is what non-binary is. It's they, them, you have to be androgynous and it has to look a certain way. And so for the longest time, I didn't feel like I was non-binary enough. And so when I like met an amazing other non-binary friend who was like, oh, well, I use combination pronouns. So they also used he, they pronouns. And for me, it was just such like sigh of relief. I was like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. That feels so comfortable for me. You know, it just felt right. And I think it was, again, just allowing myself to acknowledge, again, with why being non-binary and putting a solid definition on it is so hard, is that it defies definition, because it's about opening up space for you to be whatever you want to be if what already exists doesn't quite work for you. And so I think that was a really great moment for me.
Thank you so much for sharing that journey about like self-discovery and also learning about the new understandings of how we can come out as well, because I can understand that kind of being a difficult path, kind of working out along the way. And I think it's really good that you highlighted that as well, because I'm sure there are many other people in a very similar situation to yourself. And those combination pronouns as well are incredible, because it does allow, I guess, for different humans to feel comfortable in the skin that they are in.
Exactly.
And that's what we're trying to achieve here. And hopefully one day there will be no explanation. It will just be like, this is what I am.
Yes.
And it's understood across all societies. I just wanted to quickly remind people that if you do have any questions, just pop them in the chat and we'll definitely look to answering those towards the end there. So for the third question, what is something people commonly need to unlearn about non-binary identities? If you wanted to go, I don't know who would like to go first on this one.
Elle, do you want to go? I feel like I've been yabbing on.
I love yeah, that's actually funny, because I was sort of thinking about something that I wanted to say when you were speaking, Adam, which is another thing that you and I have spoken about massively. And in terms of both of us thinking about that and sharing that feeling of not being non-binary enough. And I think that this is a huge unlearning for people, is that the whole idea of queerness and non-binary is, I'm not sure that I identify with that. but I might identify with this. And there isn't any one way to do that. And you don't be non-binary enough. You don't have to be androgynous. You don't have to be trans. You don't have to only use they, them pronouns. And I think this is a massive unlearning that needs to happen not only in, mainstream society or whatever, but within the queer community itself. A lot of non-binary people that I know who are AFAB, which, is assigned female at birth for anyone who doesn't know. A lot of AFAB non-binary people that I know cut their hair short because they feel like, and that isn't just about gender affirmation for them. It's about how they want to be considered non-binary by other people. And that you should do whatever you want with your body, but you shouldn't be doing it to prove how non-binary you are. And so this unlearning of what non-binary might look like or sound like or, feel like, understanding that that's different for everyone is massive, is sort of one. And then number two, I found that a lot of people, if I'm meeting people and letting them know about my identity or, being non-binary, if I'm talking to another non-binary person, usually what will happen is at some point in our relationship, probably pretty early on, we'll end up having this really great, enriching conversation about gender. And I find that like really wholesome and fulfilling. And I don't feel the same way with a lot of my cisgender friends. For anyone who doesn't know, is people who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. A lot of my cisgender friends never ask me questions about my identity, even if I've come out to them and they know, because they're uncomfortable with it. So something that I think is important to unlearn is that you can always open up a space for conversation with your loved ones who are non-binary or questioning their gender or questioning their sexuality or anything about their lives. You can always open up a space for them to have that conversation without pressuring them to have that conversation. I think that people do it, people don't ask because they're scared about saying the wrong thing or because they're scared to push someone into something, when really you can just say, I'd actually love to talk to you more about this. Can you describe what that feels like for you, or what does that mean to you, or what pronouns do you want me to use for you, or whatever? So this is my dog. Anyone who wants to meet the dog is obviously out of this conversation. She goes by she, her. So, you always have the opportunity to open up the space for that conversation. And if you don't open up that space, it means that your friends, however they identify, might feel as though they don't have the opportunity to talk to you about that and that you don't understand or support them in that, which I'm sure you don't.
Yeah.
So ensuring that you can create safety around that conversation, I think, is really important.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you kind of identified between cisgendered and also your other non-binary friends, because that is a big discrepancy, and it's obviously something that we're looking to change. But those conversations, like you said, it can be born out of fear or just an inability to be able to take that on. But I think the more we talk about it and the more that we learn and unlearn, hopefully we can make that space in cisgendered, our fellow cisgendered humans. So hopefully that kind of discrepancy starts to close. But it is a really interesting point that you make in that respect, and one I hadn't really considered myself.
No, totally. And I think that a lot of people don't, but I do want to take a moment here that, like, when I was coming out to some of my friends and having some of these conversations, and this is an issue that I still have now, if your friend is coming out to you as trans, queer, non-binary, whatever, they're still the person that you've always known. So you always able to have a conversation with them as them. I'm still Elle, I'm still Elinore, I'm still the person that my loved ones have always known. And that doesn't change because I'm non-binary and I'm now opening up to you about something that I've known about myself probably for quite a long time. So I've actually always been that person. I'm just telling you about it now, And so that space where your loved ones can feel safe to have that conversation and feel loved and supported by you, because it's scary as all hell, honestly.
Yeah, and again, that's great advice for anyone who does have those special people in their lives, to create that safe space. But I do notice a change, especially like my personal experiences when people do kind of come out as queer or non-binary. There is a bit of a shift in the relationship, and it's really disheartening to see. So it's really important that we kind of continue to remind ourselves that that is something that we need to keep at the forefront, and that they're the same person that they've always been. So thank you for drawing those points. Like they're incredible. Over to you, Adam. What is something that people need to commonly unlearn?
I think for me, this is kind of maybe at a slightly higher level in terms of dealing with the individual and more about the individual kind of interacting with the state. Is just that, like, there's still so much focus around the concept of being trans or gender diverse and medical intervention, right? And so it's this idea of, if you want to affirm your gender, you have to have some kind of medical intervention at some point to kind of have that recognized officially by the state. Now, the laws are completely different across the country, and they're completely different between state and federal, but it means that, like, most non-binary people generally will just kind of keep their identity documents as they were from when they first received them, and kind of matching up with what they were assigned at birth. Or the documents won't fully align between state and federal because the laws are different. So I think that for me, that's kind of one of the things that I've really struggled with recently, because it's like, I've gotten to a place where, you know, I want to affirm my gender in an official way and affirm being non-binary in an official way, and get that X on my passport on next to the gender marker, which still working on it, but we're getting there. But it's that thing of, you know, like, I can do that, right? I can do that at a federal level. I can get to that point. But if I don't ever have, well, unless the laws change, which would be amazing, but if I don't have medical intervention, I cannot change my birth certificate in New South Wales. It just cannot be done, right? That's just the way it is. And so for me, it's really that thing of, like, I think there needs to be this change around kind of, again, the medicalization of queerness and kind of, you know, gender diverse identities, is because we're still stuck in this kind of phase of trying to pathologize and kind of put a medical lens over the top of it, because that makes it official and we can control it in that way, and we have better understanding of it. And so I think it makes it really hard for people who choose not to align with a binary gender, whether you're trans or cisgender, to actually affirm their gender in an official way. And I think it's really something that needs to be kind of, you know, considered more and made easier for people to actually access and do at a state level.
That's really interesting, actually, like that you kind of come from a different perspective than Elle. And I think both perspectives really kind of create the full circle of where we need to be focusing our efforts, both close to home, but also at a legislative level. And it's also quite disheartening to see their discrepancies between the different jurisdictions and the federal jurisdiction as well, because those laws should be aligning and supporting the citizens in which they proclaim to support.
And that's also too, and that's not to say like good work hasn't already been done. I mean, you know, it's amazing that in this country you can, for example, you know, change the gender marker on your passport, and if you are doing it because of gender affirmation, you know, it doesn't cost you anything to do that. So that's really exciting. So there are some good things that are happening, but there's still certainly a lot that needs to be done. And it's great that you do recognise that as well, because I guess unfortunately many people don't have I guess the liberties that we do have here in Australia. But it's really important to, I guess, recognise the work like you did that we have done and what we need to continue to do. So we did have a question from a participant, and I think this is kind of towards your comments, Adam, and it is, how does your different identity markers, example, race, sexual orientation, ability, body size, shape, class status, etc., influence or interact with your experience of gender? Right, okay, interesting. So more about how, so more about how those kind of official markers interact with gender.
Yes, I believe so. How does your different identity markers, influence or interact with your experience of gender?
Sure. Well, I guess it is that thing. I mean, you know, we've kind of touched on it briefly a little bit there is this, you know, the concept of privilege, right? And so, you know, Elle and I being white fellas and coming from, you know, relatively middle class backgrounds, it's like we do, and living in metropolitan areas, it does kind of create this environment where, you know, it needs to acknowledge that we, and, you know, because of the support networks, the friends and family that we have, that it is easier for us to kind of live in our fullness and, you know, fully embrace being non-binary and what that means for us, right? And so for a lot of people, it's like it may not be safe to do that. And it's even acknowledging as well that, you know, for in certain spaces as well, personally, you know, presenting as fairly masculine most of the time, and most people on a day-to-day assume that I'm male, and so that affords me a certain level of privilege moving through the world that, you know, other people don't have. You know, people who may present feminine and be assumed as a woman even if they are non-binary, that you know, needs to also be acknowledged. So I think it is that thing of, you know, privilege, like, you're not excluded from privilege if you're non-binary, like, not at all. Like, you know, it's one of those things that it's just it is something that still overlays every aspect of who we are. And I think it's one of those things that, like, and I always think it's really important to acknowledge that, like, particularly when you're looking at how all of these things interact, is that personally, I don't think it's beneficial to try and kind of tear someone down for their privilege, but I think it's important to educate people to be aware of their privilege so that they can recognize the lack thereof in others, and thus use their privilege to help other people. So anyway, that's just, yeah, a side note.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to, I guess, explain how that does interact with your identity markers, and that concept of privilege, whilst it's inescapable for just about anyone who does have it, like you said, it's important to acknowledge it and then be able to help those who don't have it kind of embrace their fullness as well. Did you have anything you'd like to add, or would you like to answer that question as well, Belle?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to throw a few points in because I feel like there's like a lot of curiosity in that question. I think it's a great question. And I think that the person who asked the question is brave, because it seems like they're maybe the only person who's asked the question. So go ahead and ask questions. We don't bite. We're not going to cancel you. But I do think there's an important point to make there about these sort of like cultural differences, class difference, that metropolitan and remote regional area difference that I think is often not spoken about. But, you know, that comes in a lot of different ways as well. So that it's not just about privilege, but this intersectionality and understanding the way that can be navigated can look really different for different people. So, you know, a friend of mine is Aboriginal and they're on a gender journey at the moment, and is sort of struggling to imagine how to have that conversation with their community, right? Whereas I've spoken to another person who is non-binary and they're Aboriginal from a different community, that they had a different gendered spirit to what they'd been assigned at birth. So these things can interact in a lot of different ways. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day who has been navigating through different pronouns, also something to unlearn. These things are fluid and they can change at any time. And they're now using, when I met them, we're using they, them pronouns, and are now transitioning to be using he, they pronouns, and quite strongly so. And I was talking to them and sort of saying, you know, acknowledging my privilege, that because I'm cis passing, because I can enter the female bathroom and nobody bats an eyelid. And we were having this conversation. They said, no, I think you're like not acknowledging how kind of shitty that is for you, that people are assuming that you're a cisgendered female all the time and erasing this non-binary identity of yours. And I was saying, yeah, but doesn't it suck for you if you like want to use the men's bathroom, or if you're trying to find a gender neutral bathroom and the only bathroom is a disabled bathroom, which is where, you know, ability comes in, right? Do you where is your right to use a gender neutral bathroom if the only gender neutral bathroom is an accessible bathroom that somebody else might need to use? quite quickly, because ability interacts in different ways as well. And sometimes bladder or bowel issues can be a big factor for that, right? You don't want to be occupying that space. So it is really important to acknowledge the different ways that intersectionality is going to interact or change the way that these things are happening for people in their lives, and acknowledging that, and acknowledging that, you know, none of these things, culture or gender or ability or race, class, whatever, are going to be happening in a vacuum in a homogenous way, and that there are a lot of things interacting all at once.
They are some incredible points, and it kind of makes me want to skip a couple of questions because you've raised so many key issues there. So I'm going to jump ahead. Sorry, not following the order of things, but I'd love to know from I'd love to know from both of you guys what you guys would think needs to change in a legislative level, or, you know, for non-binary people to kind of thrive in those communities, talking about those, though I know it's a mammoth task because there is so much, but what are some of the more pressing or urgent ones or changes you would like to see? Speaking about bathrooms and, you know, the erasing or getting that mark on your passport, and erasing part of that identity. What are some of the more pressing or urgent ones that, you know, us as a community could be campaigning to make it a little bit more comfortable for our non-binary friends?
You go, Adam. I've been yarning.
Yeah. All good. I think, as I mentioned before, I think the first thing is really the removal of the requirement for medical intervention to make adjustments to your birth certificate. I think that's kind of the key thing, and adding, you know, an X marker as an option across all official documents, I think is one of the key areas, so that, you know, being non-binary and having, you know, that kind of gender marker is something that can be officially recognized across all forms of identification, and so that it can match up across all forms of documentation. I think that's one of the really key areas that I would like to see more movement in, and I think something that really shouldn't be seen as particularly difficult to achieve, particularly, you know, once you've got that kind of backing from the legislature. Otherwise, I think it's also then looking more at a community grassroots level to actually kind of increase funding in kind of funding for money to support those communities that I think sometimes fall through the gaps a little bit, you know, because there is this still outside of the queer community, this kind of homogenizing of us, you know, as kind of all this one acronym, and we're all in it together. And it's about not recognizing that there's different specific needs within those acronyms for each group, right? And so I think that, you know, kind of a better awareness of that would be really, really great. And I think it comes back to that thing of just actually listening to what people want and need. And I think too often, you know, particularly working in Indigenous education and working at an Aboriginal cooperative, I see it all the time of, you know, being told what you want and what you need, versus actually having the people with the money and with the power actually listening and asking, you know, and sitting with the elders or sitting with queer people and saying, well, what is it that you actually need? And so I think that is one of the easiest ways that we can actually kind of see proper change happen, but it just happens too infrequently is the problem. So I think for me, that seeing a lot more listening going on would be really great.
Yeah, and I think that lived experience and I guess cooperative approach from those who it does impact is such a key element in that, because we have policy drafters that are drafting legislation or making legislative changes on elements and things that don't impact them whatsoever. So I think having that cooperative approach and having that lived experience is a great way to create those nuances. And I mean, it's difficult to get right at any point because it's such a broad sweeping thing, but to just go on deaf ears, like you said, and not kind of have any input, it's like, well, you're starting already 10 squares back. So it's a really great point that you make. How about you, Elle?
I mean, look, Adam's brilliant, and I think they've hit the nail on the head with a lot of they've said there. because I think the thing is, like you said, Katie, it's really hard to get it right. And our community is vastly diverse, right? In a lot of different ways. We've just spoken about the intersectionality and all of these, identifiers and life experiences that are going to influence the way that we live our lives. And, in an ideal world, everything's, everyone's supported in all of those different ways. But I recognize that it's really complex and we can't make these sweeping rules for everyone. But surely we can ask people and listen to them. I recently applied for a role on a gender equality panel that encouraged men and women to apply. It's like, that is so specific. It's a gender equality panel and you've really binaried the shit out of it. Did I feel comfortable applying? Did I feel comfortable identifying myself in that application? How many forms do you fill out, Adam, where it's man, woman, other, or just man or woman? You don't even have the other, and it's like, am I the other? Like, that sucks, And so I think color me cynical, but that grassroots thing is really important because the top-down approach historically hasn't worked very well for subjugated groups, right? Who sits in those decision-making spaces and how many people are they asking about these kinds of things, right? So while there, can be clear policy change to be more specific for non-discrimination laws or avenues for people to make those kinds of complaints and have that understanding, a big part of it is going to be that community engagement piece, funding so that we can do those things, workplaces and organizations like community organizations and events and stuff, doing that kind of auditing of their process. Like, how does this feel for people? I just saw someone ask a question, which, sorry, I know that we're about to get to answering, about how safe you feel in your workplace, but it's like, yeah, okay, I can sort of come and say, this is who I am and not be, bashed for my gender identity. But there are many workplaces that I haven't come out at because it was not indicated to me that it was safe to do so. And there are ways that we can do that. And there are plenty of resources online where you can find out ways to make your space safer for people to come out with, their queerness or their gender, or to apply as an Aboriginal person or a person with a disability. If I see a thing saying we're an equal opportunity employer, it's like, well, prove it, because you say you're an equal opportunity employer and you encourage, men, women, Aboriginal, and etc. to apply. It's like, well, I don't know, man. If I show up in that workplace, how am I going to be received when I'm trying to have conversations? When, friends of mine have gone into a workplace where they were in a specifically Aboriginal identified role and then got to their workplace and said, you're asking me to audit your workplace and make it a safer place for Aboriginal people, yet I'm being shot down for all of my ideas and I'm not being given funding and I'm not being given support and I'm the only Indigenous person in this workplace. It's like, some of it's simple and some more complex, but I think there are a lot of resources out there.
Absolutely. And it's not like it's too difficult to say all humans are encouraged to apply, or if you've got the necessary skill set, please apply. Like,
right.
I just, the need for society to categorize people is just, it's so outdated. I am going to ask some questions that have come through the chat box. So one question from another participant for both Elle and Adam is, how do we support and collectively uprise against the current state-sanctioned laws that prevent non-binary as an official identity without medical intervention? Are there current campaigns that we can join as allies?
Adam,
So I think, honestly, like, one of the best ways to kind of support that kind of work, and one of the best ways that I find most validating from like friends, family, and allies, is when they step in to try and educate others so that we don't have to as non-binary people all the time, and so it's about seeing those people, first of all, taking an active role as an ally to just learn a bit more. So, if you're an ally and you've come along tonight, thank you so much. That's amazing. We love you. You're the best. Because you're learning a bit more and you're hearing from non-binary people speak. And so you'll take that away and you'll then be able to share that information with other people who are in your life and who may say something that you go, hold on a minute, that's really gendered and that shouldn't be allowed and that's fucked up. So I'm going to call that out, and it's about really doing that. I think honestly that is kind of, rather than, you know, following a campaign or kind of signing up to something, it's honestly just about having the willingness to have those conversations with people in your life when they arise, you know, and not seeing it in a way of kind of to try and cause conflict or, you know, things like that, but just literally to just go, you know, I want to be a better human, and I have people in my life, or I've interacted with people who feel this way or who identify in this way, and it's, you know, such a core part of who they are, and I want to respect that, just as I hope, you know, other people respect me for my humanity as well. And so I think that at that really, really grassroots level of just being willing to have those difficult conversations with others and seeing allies doing that is so amazing, and one of the best things you can do.
Oh, well said, well said. And that really centers around education, and knowing that it's like okay as an ally to step up and educate other people as well, and advocate for our non-binary and those who are on that gender journey. Would you like to add anything else?
Yeah, I'll be really brief because I've just gone on and on, I think. But I think that I think that, yeah, like what Adam said, and I think I can understand the sort of want to be like, where's the march that I can go to? And especially if you're not in queer spaces, whereas Adam and I spend a lot of time in these queer spaces, and for us, it can often be really important to have somebody say, hang on, that wasn't a cool thing to say, or like, you know, or do a little bit of Googling before you start to kind of ask these questions where you go, well, how come some people use, you know, it's like, okay, so there's they, them, but then some people use they, he, and like, what does that mean in this like eye-rolly way where then I have to be like, oh, I don't even like feel like having this conversation because you've totally invalidated my identity, right? So like, you know, doing a little bit of self-education before you're coming into these spaces and having this conversation, which exists massively out there. But in terms of wanting to increase your allyship, I think like actually spending a bit of time in queer spaces and familiarizing yourself with that. So like, for example, I know people like as an analogy, I suppose, like the discomfort with like they, them pronouns. I was thinking about how I remember when I found it a bit tricky or like a little bit like kind of awkward, or it felt like a bit cringy to use they, them pronouns. And now it feels really great. Like not just when people use they, them pronouns for me, but it feels really great to use they, them pronouns for someone else. Like it's also affirming for me to refer to somebody else by
so validating.
It's so fantastic. So becoming really familiar with that kind of stuff. And I think that there are campaigns that are always going to be run by organizations like ACON, LGBTIQ plus Health Australia, -18, like what are they called, 2010, and that this is like these are spaces where you can Google and find out where they're having those conversations. 2010 is for they have like a blog where people are sharing their personal experience all of the time, which is really great. Being able to go to some of the events, attending the Mardi Gras march isn't just the parade, but where you're marching in the street. The Trans Day of Visibility is going to have a lot of non-binary trans people there, and those are ways that you can support people and also show your support for your loved ones. If your loved ones see that you're attending these events and having these conversations and being a part of these campaigns, they see you as a safe person to have those conversations with. And I certainly do in my personal life. I love how I was like, I'm going to make it brief, and then was like, I'm going to rant about politics.
No, we love it, and we're here for it because that's what we're here to. We are here to hear from both of you about this conversation and every nuance about it. So ramble away. We have had another question come through, and it is at the top of the conversation, Adam made an interesting point about the definition of non-binary as a movement away from classification. I'm curious about how both panelists feel if the X marker, e.g. on a passport, leans back towards classification. And do either of you feel that classification, male, female, X, marking or any other preferred gender representation is necessary for any formal documentation? Like what is why are we indicating this? Like
do away with it altogether, in my opinion. I mean, I love that, right? Like totally. Is it necessary? Most of the time, 99% of the time, no, it's not. You know? So yeah, exactly. And so I think it is that thing of like totally ideal world, you just get rid of it. Logistically, in terms of what can actually be achieved, I don't think that's going to happen straight away, to be realistic, you know. And so I guess, you know, the idea of having the option of to choose an X marker without medical intervention, you know, as an option, is that kind of middle ground of where we are right now and what would be great to see happen. But going forward, yeah, do away with it altogether. Go off.
There's no need for it. Like, unless you need it for a medical reason to do with a body, that is the only reason you would ever need to and why are we indicating it that? The doctor's got eyes, they can work it out.
Yeah.
They've got the degrees.
I think as well, there's an important point to make here. And if I get like a little bit conceptual, try and stay with me. I think there's an important point to make here where there's sort of like, when you talk about this sort of like dominant paradigm, right? And we imagine that the dominant paradigm, like this world is designed for a cisgender man who's middle-aged, works full-time, has 2.5 children, owns a house, and has a housewife at home. And that is what the world is designed for, right? And when you sit outside of that, you sort of go, oh, like this world isn't designed for me. And then somebody says, this world isn't designed for me either. Do you want to be friends about it? And then you identify with one another. So then you start to create this identity, right? And this is what happens in queer community. And this is a conversation that I have with a lot of my queer friends, right? Queer community says, we've been othered. We've been othered by this community, so we're going to create our own community where we get to identify with one another. But exactly as the person who's asked this question has sort of, you know, maybe hinted at, or maybe this wasn't what they were getting at and I'm going there anyway, then that becomes its own space that people feel up from, the way that Adam and I have both said we didn't feel non-binary enough, right? So these people have said, you created these two genders. I don't feel like I identify with that. And somebody else has gone, I don't feel like I identify with it either. And then a bunch of other people have done that and they said, we're non-binary, or we're trans, or we're gender non-conforming, or we're fluid, right? And we identify with one another and we can do that. But you don't fit in with us because you identify too much as a woman or too much as a man, or it's not quite right, you know? And then you do sort of get these identities. So it's kind of tricky because identity is really important to feel at home, and a sense of belonging and have this shared identity with someone is really great. Like I've said, when I meet other non-binary people and we have this conversation, it's enriching and beautiful and gorgeous, and I love that. But at the same time, I've felt really othered by the non-binary community as well. So I think this is an issue that we have with identities. But I don't know what the answer is, you know, because I think that it's important to have these identities. When I see someone else being queer, like, you know, showing these markers, like, you know, like I sort of have these markers of queerness, or like, you know, like Adam will often like wear earrings or, you know, whatever. And they're kind of these markers of queerness. And you kind of have this like little thing where you go, hey, you're queer and I'm queer. That was queer nod that we have with each other, and it's really, really great and enriching and community building and gorgeous, and identity can be really important like that, but it can also be exclusionary and restrictive because, you know, then sometimes if I misgender myself, like obviously I identify very closely with the female experience. I was socialized as a woman growing up. I went to you know, if I spend time in female only spaces, then I feel I'm betraying my non-binary identity, you know, so it can be this sort of restrictive thing. And having those markers, those boxes can be really important if you're a trans woman, to finally be able to tick Mrs. or Miss or woman or female can be so important for you. But at the same time, be really restrictive. So it's sort of these both things. And I don't think we have an answer for that. And I think that we're in a really transitional period as a society with sort of saying, what is identity? What does it mean? And I think that figuring that out and creating it can be like really challenging, but also really beautiful. So I don't know, let's do it together.
I love that. And that like openness to kind of cooperate as well, which is going to be so necessary moving forward. And you're right, we're on that transitional period where we need to be asking these questions and be making these large changes. And also looking at the intent behind it. Why are we asking people to identify themselves? Is it really necessary? And asking those more like those questions that apparently have not been asked before, which is really disappointing, but I don't need to tell you guys that. So we are due to wrap up a bit shortly, so I'll probably ask one more question of you both. So I think on a more general note, what are the support inclusive and thriving communities, and what can allies do and take from those thriving communities and give to those thriving communities?
Elle, shall I start?
Please.
Yeah. So I feel like, so I feel like we've obviously talked about it a lot already, but it's that key thing around education, right? And so it's about taking the time to, you know, go and read a book. I mean, I've got one here. It's a great recommendation. It's called The Book of Non-Binary Joy. I don't know if you can see it, by Ben Peachy.
I love that.
So
That looks great.
I would totally recommend this as a read. Like, you know, if you are non-binary yourself, if you're, you know, gender non-conforming or gender diverse, or if you're an ally, I would totally recommend it as just a really joyful, happy read that just really goes through, you know, the non-binary experience. So, you know, education, right? So I think that is one of the biggest things that allies can do, is to just actually take that time to go and do that work and do a bit of reading and do a bit of education, you know, and actually step up in that way, so that you are coming in already informed about that, and you don't put the labor of that education onto, you know, queer and non-binary people, because it does get really tiring, you know, like it does become that thing of like, you know, you do go to work and you get misgendered every single day, and then people, you know, if you call it out, and then people kind of get all up in arms about it and are really confused. And it's like, well, if people had maybe taken a moment to do a bit of education beforehand, they may kind of choose to, you know, not use so much gendered language around someone where they don't actually know, you know, the gender of that person, and that hasn't been confirmed, you know, between a conversation they may have had. So yeah, I think it always comes back to education. I think is really important, and also just like listening to people as well. And you know, I know I talked about this already as well. I think it's that education and listening. It keeps coming up and up and up again and again. But it's like when people tell you that is how they are, or this is how they're feeling, that's not an invitation for you to kind of try and challenge it because you don't believe them, you know. Like I think that yeah, right. And I think that happens, is that people want to kind of challenge it, and it's not that's not why people want to talk to you about it, right? Like that's not why we're doing that. We're not doing this to be kind of, you know, kind of on the fringes and out there and really cool. It's like we're just trying to honor how we feel on the inside, and how and hold space and have grace for our full selves. And that obviously looks different for everyone. And for some people that looks like being non-binary, like Elle and I. So I think that is also a really big thing too, is believing people and listening to them when they, you know, feel safe enough to share their full identity with you. And it's been so validating for me personally with my friend group, who've just been so amazing, and just, you know, hearing them use both of my pronouns is so validating, because often when you use combination pronouns, people will just default to the one that most aligns with how you appear. So I often just get he still a lot, but all of my friends are so amazing, and they use he, they just interchangeably in conversation. And it is honestly the most just like validating and joyful thing. It really is just so beautiful. So, you know, yeah, if people have got combination pronouns, you know, just put in that little bit of extra effort and use both of them. It's great.
Yeah.
Over to you, Elle. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, yeah, like we've spoken so much about things. I mean, if we were going to do a quick recap, we would sort of say, you know, you want to be supporting your loved ones. You want to be, there are like a lot of, I mean, like, you know, there are little things that you can do for your education, change the way that your Instagram algorithm works so that you're seeing more of these things, so that it becomes more normalized for you, so that it's less sort of challenging for you, because as non-binary people, we know when it's challenging for you, and then it makes it feel like we are challenging for you, which is then in turn challenging for us, you know. And I think that a big thing is that it sort of seems, for a lot of cisgender people, it seems like this scary kind of like other thing. And I often find, like Adam was sort of saying, that sometimes people get like defensive, or, you know, and it's like, me being who I am doesn't actually attack or change you being who you are. And I actually, you know, while I choose to be this person every day, it's not really much of a choice for me, because I'd be miserable if I didn't do it. But I tell you, it's really hard. Like, if I wanted my life to be easy, I'd just cruise through wearing my little woman outfit every day, you know, and doing that and put that costume on and live that way. It's really challenging to be doing this. And the reason it's challenging is because of the way that people respond to it. So I really think that the best way to be an ally is for your immediate loved ones, and then of course the broader community in the ways that we've spoken about policy, about campaigns, about normalizing things, about changing the language that you use and letting other people know about the ways that they can change the language that they use, and that thing, the education piece. So I think that you know, there's an important distinction between doing education that you can do yourself, which is understanding basic things like pronouns and that people have varying experiences, or coming to a webinar like this, right? And then there's education about people personally. So that's where the listening piece comes in. You know, when you want to speak to someone that is your loved one or someone that you've just met, that is something that you can't get from Google, and you can't put this blanket thing down. And so while we don't want people to be, you know, while we don't want non-binary people to be having to do all of that education and all of that emotional labor for people, we also want them to be listened to and say, actually, these are the pronouns that I want to use. And actually, I would love it if you use they, them for me sometimes, even if I use she, they pronouns, and you just want to use she because it's easier for you. They, them is really affirming for me. Or, you know, I would prefer if you didn't invite me to things that are specifically for that gender, or I do want to be invited to those things. Have that conversation, because everyone's an individual, and there's education that can be done in a broader sense that shouldn't have that labor be put onto non-binary people. And then there's a personal conversation between you and that person. It should be really about listening and understanding and knowing how you can best support your loved ones or your loved ones' loved ones. This is a conversation for everyone to have. And you might not have non-binary people in your life. In all likelihood, you do. You just might not know so yet. But it's probably something that's going to come up for you. The number is growing. Things are changing. People are realizing things about themselves. And the more that this becomes accepted and the more that this conversation happens, the more that people go, maybe that's me. And you want to be able to support your loved ones through that, through any conversation about gender, really. That goes for transness as well.
Thank you so much. I think it's such a great point to kind of end on about what people can kind of take away from this session and this conversation. And I want to say a huge thank you to both Adam and Elle for your energy and your time this afternoon in educating us about breaking the binary bias. So thank you so much for that, guys. And we should be able to have the recording out to you guys shortly. So thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you have all a wonderful night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
It's been
everyone.
really great. Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.